Welcome to Engineered for Impact, a podcast helping engineers learn and think more about how they can have a positive social impact with their careers. In this episode, I talked to Matthew Gentzel, the co-lead of Longview Philanthropy's Nuclear Weapons Policy Program. Matthew's career has primarily been focused on policy, but he's also worked in fire engineering, artificial intelligence, and national security. And as such, we discuss a broad range of topics in this episode. We cover Matthew's journey from the Air Force Academy to fire engineering, AI policy, and nuclear security, the benefits of developing broad situational awareness and diverse teams in policy, many topics related to nuclear security, international policy, and artificial intelligence. We talk about Longview Philanthropy's key grant-making areas, and how Matthew has approached his career and career changes, as well as recommendations that he has for other engineers who are interested in doing work in the policy space. You'll find show notes with valuable resources related to this episode at engineeredforimpact.show/Matthew. That's MATTHEW. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. And without further ado, here's Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matthew Gentzel. I work as the co-lead of Longview Philanthropy's Nuclear Weapons Policy Program. Basically, I do grant evaluations and nuclear priorities research looking for ways to reduce the risk of large-scale nuclear war, namely between US and Russia or between US and China. Those would be the cases we're most interested in looking to mitigate.
Terrific. Well, thank you for joining me today, Matthew. I guess you've had quite an interesting journey starting out as a fire engineer, and now you've ended up working on nuclear weapons policy grant making. So are you able to take me through that journey of how you got from studying fire engineering to doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, my background's quite a bit complicated and tricky to explain quickly. I think there's a few pieces of context that help link up more about my background and put it into a bigger picture. The first is that a common theme that unifies almost all the things I've done in my career is that I've always been interested in things that have at least some prospect of helping people at scale or defending people at scale. And that really drew me into technology, policy, and engineering, especially just policy, like things where you change a law and it affects a whole country at a time. And lastly, defense, because some of the most consequential things in history have been great power wars. And with that context in mind, I actually, before I even went into fire protection engineering, I don't know if it's on my LinkedIn, but the first place I actually started school was the Air Force Academy, where I did a semester before I left. My original plan in high school was basically to do political science and engineering at one of the US service academies as like the base of my career. But this turned out to not really be a good plan in terms of my personality on a few levels. The first thing was just to even get into a academy. It's not just good grades, good fitness, test scores, etc., extracurriculars, but also you have to get a political nomination. And playing politics is maybe not my strong suit historically. On the Republican side, I had to interview with my representative. And while most of the interview went well, some comments I made on improving the effectiveness of foreign aid, I think, left him with the impression I wasn't patriotic enough. So I didn't get the Republican representative's nomination. Then on the Democratic side, I had an interview with senators, and they, for some reason, had me interview with a Coast Guard officer. And the Coast Guard officer got offended because I hadn't applied to the Coast Guard Academy. And I don't remember what I said. Being as blunt as I was at that age, I might have said something like, "Oh, not as good of a school," or not impacting as many people. I don't remember what I said, but that ruled me out there. So the question was, how was I going to get into any academy? And I lucked out. My liaison to the Air Force Academy got my resume to Vice President at the time, Biden's desk. And there's only 5 vice presidential nominations, but I actually got his. And so at one level, it made me look super impressive because there's so few. But the real reason was I couldn't get a congressional nomination. And if he had actually interviewed me rather than just taken this Air Force liaison's word, I have no idea. if that actually would have worked out or not. But once I was at the academy, the classes themselves were incredible. I had one of the best history classes I've ever had. I mean, some of the in-class experience was just very good, and they really have a sort of like anti-hindsight bias approach. And I remember this one week in class, professor said, "Don't read anything, just come to class prepared." And we're saying, "What the hell does that mean?" You show up to class, there's maps all over the walls, and it's a scenario from World War I. And they divide us up into groups, and each group is to present a plan for winning this World War I battle. And at the end of class, people go in turns, one by one, presenting their plans. And the professor has this deck of note cards and a deck of slides. And after each person presents their plan, he hands them a note card, and there's a picture of some military officer, colonel, general, who knows, has their name. It has a rough layout of the plan they executed, and he would just say, "And this is why you died." And in almost every case, with every student team, they did something which was predictable in some manner that someone had done in reality in World War II under analogous circumstances, and like how it was countered by the other side. And he had just like so thoroughly mapped out so many examples that there wasn't really anyone in class that presented something that was new. And sort of part of the idea was to illustrate that when you're encountering a scenario for the first time and you have to think it through, you will invariably default to certain kinds of behaviors that might be predictable. And that it really helps to read a lot of history to sort of humble yourself, to get a sense of just kinds of mistakes that people tend to make. Now, anyway, that was the good side of the academy. The bad side of the academy, as soon as you're out of these really great classes, your free time is fairly managed. You have some freedom, but it really depends on which squadron you're in. And on my end, I mean, I was a hell of an autodidact, very self-disciplined. In the academy environment, I mean, I would joke I was getting weaker. I was a 150-pound cross-country runner before. I lost 15 pounds, could do half as many push-ups as I could at the start, half as many pull-ups. So that was one trend that wasn't looking good for me with the way they do their training. I joke sometimes that maybe it's really about making you more impervious to being tortured if you're captured from a downed aircraft than it is about making you super fit like the Marines, but I'll leave that aside. But the real issue I had was I didn't have time to be an autodidact, to study more in my free time. I didn't really have the ability to set myself apart from other students via additional studies, because so much of your free time is marching in squares and cleaning things and following a lot of just, I don't know, sort of scheduled programming, mandatory fun, that sort of stuff. A particular funny story that's the exception that proves the rule is I once got the highest grade on a chemistry exam at the Air Force Academy. Had nothing to do with me being a better student, had everything to do with me getting better sleep because I was good at counter-hazing strategy. The night before the exam, a bunch of upperclassmen came to flip everyone's beds and wreck everyone's rooms for the freshmen, because if they do that, you have to stay up all night cleaning to be ready for morning inspections. I had 2 football player roommates, and they're like, "Matt, we're not letting anyone in this room. We want to do well in this exam." They go out in the hallway, and they're both linemen. One's 200 pounds, the other's 300 pounds. And I just hear the horde coming down the hallway, and they just go flying down the hall. So I slam the door shut, lock it. You're not allowed to lock it, but they're also technically not allowed to do these hall brawls and be physically fighting like that. So it was sort of this escalation scenario where both the upperclassmen and me were doing stuff you technically weren't allowed to do in the rules. They attacked the guard desk to get master keys to unlock the door. And as they unlocked one lock, I would lock the other lock. They attacked another guard desk so they could get 2 master keys. And so then I escalated to the next level, which was unlock the rifle rack on our wall. And these are fake rifles, but jam basically a fake M16 through the door handle. So even when they get both master keys in, they couldn't get it open. And so even though the whole wall was warping and the other rifles were swinging, they were shaking the wall so hard with maybe 6 people on the door, they couldn't get in. And so I had the only room not wrecked in the squadron. Me and my roommates helped other people clean up the rooms a bit, but I mean, they had been fairly beat up. So I was probably the best rested person for this chemistry exam, so I got the highest grade. So that gives a sense of why I felt the academy wasn't quite for me.
Yeah, that's a pretty
I,
intense environment.
it was I sort of viewed it as a trade-off between prestige and the potential to maximally know what I was doing, because just all this time you have to spend your attention on these other things. There's not as much, academic studies you can do, and I've always just been quite an autodidact. So to leave the academy, I had to figure out a way to transfer schools. I'd lost a lot of my fancy school options. My father had been in fire protection for quite a long time. He was Maryland State Fire Marshal and pointed out to me that the fire protection engineering program at Maryland was something I could still get into. I had always wanted to do engineering and to start out with a quantitative basis. And so I figured I would start that program and then potentially pivot majors years later once I'd gotten through the earlier parts of the class. If you go into this major at that time, basically you could do volunteer firefighting, and this would enable you to get tuition remission. So, I mean, I was very interested in volunteer firefighting. I'd always been very interested in helping people, but it was also a very busy scenario. And because I wasn't inherently interested in fire, I think that also like biased my attention. I wasn't purely focused on my academics during my time at the University of Maryland. I was exploring lots of things and trying to figure out how I could get on a career track that was comparable with the career track I would have been on at the Air Force Academy. And so I was exploring many different groups. This is ultimately when I came to run into the effective altruism movement and started a group at the University of Maryland. But yeah, as I got towards senior year, at each decision point when I was deciding, oh, will I change my major to political science? Will I change my major to this, to that? It just never looked like it would be worth it because I would have all these additional classes to take. It would cost more as opposed to graduating earlier and then doing something like a data science boot camp to broaden out my quantitative skills. And so that's ultimately what I did. After I finished UMD, I initially got a grant to do effective altruism policy analytics, which I did with Richard Bruns and a few other students, which was basically us organizing policy comments in response to notifications on the US Federal Register. Basically, regulatory agencies, when they're proposing to change some rule, have to put out some notification. And by responding to these with policy comments, especially if you have potentially interested groups, academic experts signing on to your comment and producing novel analysis or novel arguments that the agency hasn't had to respond to before, you can create basically an obligation to respond. And if you have an interested group, potentially the implicit threat of lawsuit, which is just a good way to get regulatory agencies to add things to their cost benefit analyses and potentially to do better policies. If there's a risk you do something totally wrong, the hope is that the regulatory agency already knows better and therefore won't change their mind based on some dumb comment you left. And so that was the model. But ultimately, we didn't get enough feedback on the comments during the period we set up to initially run this project. The government takes sometimes years to respond to comments on the Federal Register, and we didn't want to be going for years without feedback on if what we were doing was doing anything. So we ended the project, and then I needed to find a career. I went to the Bay Area to do a data science boot camp. And then after I did that, as I started looking into data science jobs, I got recruited to this policy fellowship that was in Oakland. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I think it was called the Pareto Fellowship. And during that, there was maybe like 4 weeks of initial training and then 6 weeks of project execution. And I basically tried during the project execution period to get the data science boot camp I went to accredited as a master's program. It was basically a startup idea where the idea was you'd be able to bring in like really smart foreign nationals on F1 visas. It's not really a scam school thing because they're going to get like 6-figure salary jobs later. And this was sort of the idea of it just being really good to bring more smart people to the US, both from like a doing good and competitive perspective. But but ultimately didn't work out. It was hard to partner up with some of the groups we needed to, and I didn't start this data science boot camp I went to, so I wasn't the one owning the real decision-making power with this attempted startup. So after that point, then I was really like, okay, I need to decide, am I going to do a data science job or am I going to go back into policy? And the impression I'd gotten from this workshop and just talking from people in the San Francisco Bay Area is that within the rationality and effective altruism community, I clearly had a very strong comparative advantage at defense policy. Just from my time at the Air Force Academy, the things I spent time thinking about, even the fire protection engineering. I'd been reading a lot on nuclear winter. That was something I was, very concerned about as a potentially very large risk. But the more papers I read, the more skeptical I became of some of the models. They just initially back then did not really have much of any high quality fire models to back up some of the claims. Like once the soot's up in the stratosphere, at that point, I think the models get a lot better. But the assumptions that go into these models before that point, I was fairly skeptical of just based on the classes I had in undergrad. And so that sort of drew me in to focus on defense issues where it seemed like at relatively low effort, I would be capable of making a contribution. So then the question was how to get there. There was a conference I went to where I met Jason Matheny. He was the former director of IARPA. Now he's, IARPA stands for Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. It's basically like DARPA, but for intelligence. And he now runs the RAND Corporation, which I don't know if you know the history of RAND Corporation. I could go into that a little, but the long story short is when I met him and explained my initial career plan about, going to the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy and hoping to someday enact reforms and be influential on policy. I mean, he joked with me about some of the naive dimensions of my initial plan that was concocted in high school, but also just said, oh, why didn't you go to Georgetown? Why didn't you go to SAIS? You could just do a master's program and hop ahead to the sort of things you were interested in doing. And so I looked into those programs and found out he was exactly correct. You could get doing something much faster than you can ranking your way up through the military. And I mean, there's legitimate reasons for this. Like the US, we're a democracy. We set up our military to have civilian control of the military. So you don't want a system where in peacetime, someone can extremely quickly go from like the bottom ranks of the military to the top. It's just like not a good situation if you want to prevent coups and stuff like that. Whereas on the more civilian side, where you have influence but not command, it's more okay to have things potentially go faster if you're generating actually good ideas. And so with some of these programs like Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and Georgetown, you could much more quickly get into policy. So I started making a long-term plan. How would I get into one of these programs from where I was? The first step of the plan was getting into the area and doing classes that were relevant. So I ultimately took a job at the National Fire Sprinkler Association doing basically some engineering coordination and some basically an analysis of like lobbying. How would I describe this? Like one of the more interesting things I did was I built this big Monte Carlo model of all of the area in the city of Philadelphia that was not up to fire code, not really protected by fire protection systems, and try to do like a cost benefit analysis of, what does it cost based on proprietary industry data to get it up to building code? And then like how many lives on expectation would that save? And so I was executing this kind of policy effect modeling skill that I thought would be highly useful if I were to go into defense analysis, because they often make use of Monte Carlo models, something that would be useful in terms of city scale things. But also I managed to get closer to DC. I could visit DC and I could start taking classes again at the University of Maryland that were more relevant to strategic studies. So over the summer, I did basically like one class at a time. I switched majors from statistics to master's public policy. I front loaded all the good classes in their public policy program that I wanted to do. And then as soon as SAIS or Georgetown accepted me, it was SAIS, I just transferred there after a semester at the University of Maryland. My first semester at Johns Hopkins SAIS, because of my engineering background, I managed to nerd snipe their operations analysis professor into getting me an internship in industry. So I briefly worked for Lockheed about a year, and I joke, I didn't really have reservations about working for a defense contractor because of the nature of how I was working for them. A lot of people who go through these schools and then go work for defense contractors often end up in government affairs, and they're implicitly like lobbying the government to buy some defense system. Whereas I was sort of the inverse. My background was more engineering. And so I would rather be listening to US combatant commanders, listening to allies and partners, reading defense reports, and going back to Lockheed with basically prioritizations for their own research and development. Basically, what kinds of things could industry innovate on that would be valuable for providing for defense that they haven't been focused on previously. And I mean, I will say there is some bias here. Like, they're receptive to most things, but industry tends not to be receptive to things that would be like super cost effective if it's not in their like long-term competitive advantage. I think there's people often talk about the military industrial complex as if it has a bias toward war. I think the larger bias is toward cost growth. And it's just there's been so much industry consolidation. There's a lack of competition. You can still spend a lot on defense if people are fearful without being even in a war. What am I trying to get at here quickly? You don't have to blow up expensive semiconductors every time you hit a target. Like, there's much more cost-effective ways to do a lot of things. And so this was like the overall sense I got from my time in industry, was that you do have good, honest people who are focused on evaluating arguments in depth and looking for better ways to provide defense. But the fundamental bias they would have is probably toward cost growth rather than other things people speculate. But anyway, after a year at Lockheed, I saw that the U.S. National Security Commission on AI was getting spun up. I had like pre-prepared a resume for working on AI policy. AI policy long-term is just something I think is incredibly important. There's the potential for who knows the timescales, but eventually it to be one of the most important, most existential technologies. And so I had been preparing in advance. And basically, as soon as through my grad school programs, I saw the application to intern at the AI Commission, I was able to just instantly send my resume. So I was the first person to interview there. So then I was the first intern. And then COVID came. And so I got put in this position where I had my choice of research topic, and I'd already established a rapport with people at the commission. So, I got to do this really interesting literature review on techno-economic competition between states, between companies, and just to go through the literature, both in abstract and specific to AI. So I read a lot of CSET reports, but also just a lot of historic analysis of trade wars and all these different things, fundamentally looking for, how do you win these kinds of competitions? How does a country strengthen its advantages? How do they restrain what their competitors are able to do? But also, how do you constrain the nature of the competition? How do you align the nature of competition with your values and mutual interests with your competitors? How do you not just get into an uncontrolled competition that's against both sides' long-term interests? And so that was the nature of the lit review. I can't get into that many details, but at an abstract level, it basically cross-validated a lot of recommendations the AI Commission had made to that point and highlighted a few new themes that they hadn't put that much attention into yet, some on intellectual property strategy, but others in other areas. After doing that, I got promoted. I was hired on as one of their directors of research and analysis at the AI Commission. So, this was a dream for me because I'm just out of grad school, and I got this position at a commission. And the AI Commission is directly informing Congress and the executive branch about AI policy. So to chain back to this, conversation I had years before with Jason Matheny, like the impetus to do some degree of long-term planning toward getting to a school where I'd have good options and then being prepared to focus in on something on AI policy, that was like a very good idea. And when people say you can't plan things, yes, there's some things you can't plan, but you can have some long-term plans that you keep in your back pocket that are likely to pan out when an opportunity pops up.
Yeah, I think the example you gave there of having the CV or your resume ready to go for the AI commission is a perfect example of that. Like it's not that hard to just have a slightly tailored CV just sitting there in your back pocket, ready to go when the opportunity presents itself, and you kind of just looking to stack the deck in your favor as much as you can when it comes to making the most of opportunities, and good luck.
Right. And I think a big piece of it was I had many interests. I mean, risk reduction is one thing, but just I had all this military background at that point in time, and I'd been paying a lot of attention. Like, I think it's often very important to get a sense of the demand signals within your field, like what is needed. And the internship I had at Lockheed, because I was just listening to so much testimony from different US commanders and allies, like I just had a real sense of potential opportunities, things that were needed, and like opportunities you can act on that don't really, necessarily put you in a security dilemma with other countries, just things that would decisively make everyone better off if done, if people uh, bother zooming in on them. And so I think, how to put it, a theme we might get into later in this call is just cultivating, talented individuals who can work in government, in industry, at nonprofits, who have very broad situational awareness. I think one of the most valuable things being an engineer before going into policy was just the way you break down problems. And I mean, engineering as a field, it's not very, political. You're setting up your constraints, you're solving your equations. There's only so many paths that are going to be implied by the analysis, but you end up with like a very impartial mindset of how to go about solving problems. And I think the trying to get a sense of what all the trade-offs are and trying to get a sense of what are all the constraints and the problems you're trying to solve, and then going about solving these problems like an engineer can often be a good approach to coming up with good policy ideas that other people wouldn't necessarily come up with. I remember a type of flavor I had at the AI Commission, which was a little uncommon, was I would go read super partisan things, both in hawkish and dovish directions, and try to pull out pieces that were good ideas from both sides. Like if you're in a state of competition, what of the other side's concerns are totally legitimate? Where do they have rational paranoia? How do you alleviate those kinds of concerns by constraining your own behavior? On the other side, there might be like very competitive actions that aren't in the Overton window because they're associated with other stupid ideas. And you can just take off the other dumb ideas they're associated with. You don't have to, go with every crazy recommendation made by some fringe think tank. You can go through their recommendations, notice that some aren't actually that bad of idea in isolation, or when combined with something that provides reassurance. This is sort of gets into this idea, I would call it sort of conditional competitive or conditional cooperative strategy. How do you, when negotiating with other countries in a state of competition, strengthen your negotiating leverage while also making it credible that if you reach agreement, you're not going to screw over the other side by default? Like putting yourself in a position where you both have better carrots and better sticks, where the positive sum outcomes are better than they were before. But if you don't achieve agreement, that you're in a very strong position to continue forward, and develop the ability to push toward a positive sum agreement again in the future. And so that's a framing I had in mind that, I don't know, when you're in politics more, if you don't start in engineering, your thoughts can get, sort of colored to a degree by the political coalition you fall into. And I just didn't really have one when I was coming into this field. And so, I mean, this does come with trade-offs. I was a bit naive. Um, I think one of the things that was a big help to me was basically having my research protected by this colonel above me who loved the ideas and could just reframe them to be more likely to land with Congress. He could point out where my ideas were dumb. He could help me rephrase things. Um, and I was sort of insulated from the bureaucratic competition for influence. At the times I've been more directly exposed to that, it's just really hard to simultaneously figure out good ideas from first principles, figure out how to prove that they actually are good ideas, and then land them within a state of competition. Ultimately, for that sort of thing, teams will do the best. And if you're not a part of a team, you're not going to succeed at policy influence.
Is that just because you're trying to optimize for too many variables there?
Yeah, if you're like, you just get pulled too thin, and then you need some degree of specialization. But here's the real thing, though. You can't if you specialize too much, you also don't get anything done because you don't have a sense of the trade-offs from the recommendations you're pushing forward. A type of example, I won't go into specific organizations, but there was this initiative I heard of where the goal of these academics was basically to produce recommendations to increase strategic stability with China, to put US and China in a position where they're less likely to go to a major war. And they had all this analysis and all these recommendations, and they ultimately end up talking with this one person in government. And the person in government asks, okay, so if we do all these, what do we do about North Korea? What about this type of Taiwan scenario? He listed out all these trade-offs. And their basic response after, I think, like maybe more than a year of research was like, oh, we didn't think of that. And while if in the grand scheme of things, one might think these other things might not matter as much as, like, do US and China go to war? I mean, they really do matter. North Korea could do a lot of damage in some scenarios. And like, these are real trade-offs to think through in terms of, what is your defense posture and how do you make it credible that you don't have offensive aims? And just, if you're not broadly situationally aware of a lot of these kinds of trade-offs and able to articulate an argument to policymakers that highlights why it's actually worth making a particular trade-off, you're not going to get anywhere. And I had some of this experience at the AI Commission too, receiving policy comments from various groups. Some I was familiar with before, where there's a lot of things sort of aimed at avoiding an AI arms race, but where a lot of the recommendations were very under-specific and weren't really addressing the trade-offs the government was facing now. And if you're more aware of the near-term policy issues and what is and isn't in the Overton window, today, then you're going to be better at forming what trade-offs do you have to make now to avoid some worst case later. If you're not aware of the trade-offs that are in front of policymakers sooner, then they're likely to ignore sort of long-term analyses that are recommending actions that are just like immediately harmful for some of the objectives they're pursuing shorter term. Sorry for being so abstract about this, but it's just like a general principle of you do need to specialize within a team to be effective as a group, but the team overall needs broad situational awareness to actually deliver relevant policy recommendations that will land. And this is one of the things I thought was very virtuous about the AI Commission. It was nimble. It was commissioned by Congress, and you get to go the full spectrum from doing your own research to interacting with a bunch of experts to iterating with Congress to get the recommendations better and better and something they're more willing to sign on to over time. I think a good theme for intervention is just getting good experts on things like this, people who really do care about risk reduction, not just competition, into groups like this. I think it's just like a theme in the back of my mind for how you can. There really is a lot of room for technocratic, meritocratic influence on government policy, and people just don't see it from the outside. They get skeptical because of various lobbying money and whatnot. But at the end of the day, a lot of Congress people really do want to do the right thing and will be convinced by arguments. And sometimes the way they're convinced by argument is just one side has more money to do better analysis than the other side and is selective in what they analyze. And if you pull the rope sideways or put more money on the other side, but in an analytically virtuous direction, not just a spin direction. You're more likely to be persuasive.
Right. That's interesting. And so you become research director at the AI Commission, and then
I
you
should
go
clarify,
on.
there are other directors of research and analysis.
And so you ultimately end up leaving there to go work at OpenAI, as you
Right.
mentioned.
So I should clarify, everyone left the AI Commission because commissions are temporary bodies. Basically, the commission stood up by Congress, has budget for a few years, and then goes away once they've delivered their analysis to Congress. There are some commissions that stick around longer. The U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission has been around quite a while, but for the most part, congressional commissions are temporary bodies meant to deliver sort of technocratic influence that then Congress thinks through more democratically, and like decides what they will and won't implement. But anyway, after that, I went to OpenAI, and I was there for about a year. I had like two lines of effort, but the larger line of effort was more or less researching mitigations to the use of large language models in influence operations and things like that. And this was something OpenAI was interested in because they were, really leading the field in large language models. And if you set, norms in a better direction, you put out ideas on like how to get this stuff under control. Like when you put the model out there, there's the prospect of people copying it, doing all sorts of nefarious things. Like there's some degree of industry responsibility to push the technology in a better direction and to prevent some of the worst cases. So most of the year, similar to my time at the AI Commission, I was doing a very broad literature review on influence operations in general, and also focusing on the AI related subset of these types of like recommendations other people had been putting together through the years, looking for biases in the literature where certain threats not covered, looking for to make roughly a taxonomy of different things you could do to inform the paper we ultimately made and published in January, where basically this section in the paper we have on mitigations was one of the ones I had contributed to, but there are plenty more mitigations I had that didn't make the report because they weren't all related to large language models. And some things, this was an issue I had at the AI Commission too, just get really thorny. Like how do you regulate social media companies is like a really challenging task. And when you're the National Security Commission on AI, I mean your prerogative's more international, and social media companies are to some degree domestic. I mean, they obviously have an international effect too because people are using the same technologies around the world. They're international companies, but you want to avoid putting the government in a position to be hacking democracy. You want to have ways to mitigate some of the perverse effects from applications of AI while also not putting the government in a position to be manipulating people via social media itself. And it's just like, there's some really hard trade-offs there that require a lot of thought. And because we didn't get through of them on a lot of subjects, we were ultimately silent, both at the AI Commission and at OpenAI, because it's really thorny. There's a lot to get into. Like, should Section 230 be reformed? This law that basically holds companies not accountable for the content from third parties. And there's like a question of, do you want to change that? Well, if you change that, then you have some risk of like AI enabled censorship. And this was one of the things I found in my lit review that was a big blind spot. You can find all sorts of examples of disinformation campaigns and people going crazy, things like QAnon, and they'll have like a million citations, analyses of what went wrong. But in cases where you have platforms institute policies that result in some form of censorship, at least at the time, there were far fewer things you could cite. You could notice it with certain COVID policies. You could see it. A common type of example I would give would be things like YouTube, in the effort to, not glorify violence, and to push back against conspiracy theories, started a few different types of changes to their algorithm. One type of change is, if like something violent isn't fully censored, or certain words like kill or whatever pop up, you either like, restrict the video by community guidelines, or you reduce its virality. And when you have interventions like this, it makes it harder to tell in a given video, what actually happened, or at least the ones people will get to quickly. And so then another intervention is to promote, trusted sources. And this would tend to mean promoting mainstream media at the expense, not just of wild conspiracy theorists, but also at the expense of, investigative journalists, at the expense of local government, at the expense of, people who are just like kind of detective mindset, going through a very long video piece by piece, what does and doesn't this show. And so when you combine these, you end up in a situation where it's easier than usual for mainstream media to clip up videos of some event. Maybe it's a police shooting, maybe it's some other attack, in a way that will appeal to the audience of that show, while painting a very distortionary picture of what happened overall. And had you gone back to the prior equilibrium of, there's some crazy people, but you also have some really good, really rigorous things that are easy to get to, rather than buried after like 500 pages by the algorithm, it's easier for the common person to have a sense of what's going on, rather than you look like a crazy conspiracy theorist if you point out a claim someone says about something that's in the public domain isn't true. It's really a mess. But there was nothing pointing out stuff like that in the literature I was reviewing. And so I think on average, the literature on AI-enabled influence operations tends to have a bias toward countering disinformation, and not toward what do you do to prevent the wrong types of censorship. And I think a big intervention theme that sort of came out of this was, what kinds of interventions are structurally neutral? Like, are there things like just virality limits, or things you can implement that aren't going to politically advantage any particular side, but just tend to reward information that is more likely to be truthful on average, or that incentivize people to put more thought into what they put out there first. But even with this, there are some degrees of trade-offs. Sometimes people throwing out a bunch of stupid ideas is what helps you escape groupthink. Like, if an idea doesn't come to mind in the first place, you won't necessarily entertain alternative hypotheses when evaluating a given situation. And if crazy people are the first people to throw out the idea, sometimes they help people think through what has actually happened in a given scenario. On the other hand, if there's too much stigma, it might create more polarization.
Right. So you kind of want to be able to damp the system in one sense, to stop sensationalist things gaining too much traction when they're far from the truth. But at the same time, you want to allow the system, or you don't want to damp so much that you don't get these sort of course correction events where you have people starting to challenge the status quo and the norms in a space.
Right. I do think a big theme is that you do ultimately need better norms in the information ecosystem. There's just a lot of scenarios where people have the incentive to lie or spin, and it's not just like a few entities. It ends up impacting everyone. You just think of, your own friends and what their political leanings are, and how do you get along? And when you're not a decision maker on a policy, what are your incentives? This comes up in books like The Myth of the Rational Voter, but in your day-to-day life, you're more impacted by the people you have to get along with than your impact on some policy decision of which you are one of many millions of people influencing. And so your incentive to hold certain beliefs, it's stronger. You have a stronger incentive to hold beliefs that are compatible with your friends than you do to, fully deeply research some policy. There's so many policies one could learn about, right? And it's just impossible to become an expert on everything. So just by default, in a large society, that's a democracy, you can expect people to not always have very reasonable positions. And this is not something like democracy is still like the best thing we figured out. Like I'm not being anti-democratic here. I'm just like, this is a trade-off, and you have to, like, norms are part of how you deal with this. And if, people's political coalitions aren't internally punishing dishonesty, then you can be in a very bad place in political competition. I mean, to link back to what I was saying earlier about when I applied to the service academies and couldn't get a nomination from either party, the I mean, part of the issue is just, I think through policy issues in isolation. I tend to not cluster policy views, and this is an advantage at figuring things out. It's a disadvantage in terms of signaling to a political coalition, and that's a big factor in politics. Is there's an advantage in numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then what sort of precipitated the decision to move on from OpenAI to your current role?
So at the time, after we'd finished this paper on influence operations, there were a few ways I could see going in the future, but a lot of them didn't necessarily involve OpenAI because of this sort of bias I was pointing at, where a lot of the things I thought were concerning near term in terms of AI were more about social media companies than large language models. Doing that broader research wasn't necessarily something I could clearly do at OpenAI, given their focus. At the same time, there's plenty I could have done at OpenAI, but I encountered Longview Philanthropy, which is where I currently work, and I saw like their prospect of funding lots of research in the field of nuclear risk reduction. That was something that had a lot of appeal to me, both based on my prior time in strategic studies, my prior time in fire protection, and more recently, the time I spent looking at influence operations. One of the big, there are two particular cases that I thought were interesting from my time at OpenAI in terms of learning more about influence operations. One was just looking at Soviet active measures during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Stasi and KGB put millions and millions and millions of dollars into attempting to influence the peace movement. And this wasn't, just supporting the peace movement. It was often sabotaging certain parts of the peace movement. And you can see this in Thomas Ridd's book, Active Measures. I mean, there's some degree of undermining groups. I think in West Germany, there was some degree of, like, the Bertrand Russell Foundation, I think, was also a target for KGB influence. Like, the general bias of these kind of influence operations was to unify some parts of the peace movement and to divide other parts. During like the nuclear freeze movement, NATO took this sort of dual track approach, which was, if Soviet Union, you don't pull out these SS-20 missiles in so many years, we, NATO, will deploy cruise missiles, Pershing 2 or 3, Pershing 2, like basically these are very escalatory nuclear systems, because when you have missiles that are closer range, it's less warning time. The cruise missiles are harder to detect, especially with the radars the Soviet Union had at the time. And like the SS-20 missiles the Russians had deployed, you have missiles that can deploy multiple warheads, but at short range in Europe. So there's very little warning. They could target multiple cities at once if there were a crisis. These are some of the most escalatory, high-risk systems, because you don't want to hallucinate your way into war when you have so little warning time, because these systems are just so close to each other. And so rather than racing to immediately deploy missiles, NATO went with this dual-track decision, which is basically to give the Russians or the Soviet Union time to pull these back before you end up in the most threatening equilibrium, where both sides have these very dangerous missiles pointed at each other. Now, because there's this delay, this is a potential hypothesis. I'm not 100% sure it's true, but maybe one way the Soviet Union viewed this was as an opportunity to prevent NATO from deploying these counter missiles ever at all. And so a lot of the efforts they funded were sort of to shift the language that some of these groups were using. So it went from no missiles in Europe to no more missiles in Europe. They rebranded the neutron bomb as the capitalism bomb, because a neutron bomb, I don't know if you know much of the engineering of this, basically is a type of weapon that would emit a lot of short-term radiation, but not as much blast and heat. And so the idea of this was to use it against invading tank columns that the Soviet Union would presumably use in an invasion of Europe, but without destroying the cities permanently. And hopefully you've evacuated the people. Given U.S. tended to have an advantage at new technologies, not so much at numbers, Soviet Union would be opposed to that sort of thing. Some of the direction of influencing the peace movement was likely to counter nuclear power, likely to be aimed at countering nuclear power. Why? Because there's exports of natural gas from the Soviet Union. And if Europe was more energy independent with more nuclear power, that's both the potential to develop nuclear weapons, but also energy independence that makes them more independent of the Soviet Union. And so you have all these factors that were sort of influencing the peace movement to some degree. The Soviet Union spent like many millions per year on some of these efforts, largely in the late 70s and early 80s. I don't know if there were always these kinds of active measures going on. But being familiar with that history, but also that, on the other side, there's often pressures to inflate these kinds of influence efforts. And some of the efforts to inflate and pretend like there's no legitimate concerns that a lot of the peace activists have would often come from the arms industry. Sometimes you even have the arms industry too meddling with peace movement kind of stuff, although this is a bit different. An example I came across while I was at OpenAI, one of these, separate from studying influence operations, we had this project. This was maybe like 1/8 of my time. It was a tiny sliver of my time. And the overall research approach that I chose wasn't that good because it was such a small fraction of our time. Was we were looking for what are analogies to states and groups regulating strategic technologies, and what analogies can we paint to AI before you have full-blown AGI. And so this silly comparison we did was what are increasing levels of autonomy? And so we're landmines are pretty dumb, but they are autonomous. Cluster munitions, they're sensor fused, they can be a little smarter. Drones, and we made this sort of continuum of different systems and went to look into the regulatory history of them. And one of the interesting things with cluster bombs and the push to ban cluster munitions was within the U.S. defense ecosystem. Different companies, had different levels of skill at producing cluster munitions. So you end up in a situation where I'm not going to go into specifics, but this one group was basically oh, hey, we don't have to make cluster munitions. We'll just make this big fragment bomb that coats a large area and doesn't leave behind any unexploded ordnance. And while that's great in terms of, there not being things people might accidentally kill themselves with in the future, it's not great in terms of collateral damage, because you can imagine the other side. If the cluster munition tech had kept evolving, you might have weapons that are very discriminate, that know what a tank looks like, know what unarmed people look like, go off if this, don't go off if that, wait till there's no one around to self-destruct, so there's not unexploded ordnance. You can imagine the tech could have continued advancing in a lower collateral damage direction, but because the cluster munition ban treaty happened when it was, now with the situation with Ukraine, where we had these stockpiles, we didn't buy the newer ones, the kinds of munitions we ship to Ukraine, they do have a risk of leaving behind unexploded ordnance that the newer versions might not have had. So when you're negotiating these policies and trying to restrain perverse uses of technology, you have to account for, both what are bad uses of technology, and also if you freeze something where it is that the spot you want to freeze the technology? If the state ultimately doesn't fully comply. And many countries did not, sign on to the cluster munition ban treaty. I mean, really good example was Finland. They banned landmines, but I mean, they had this huge border with the Soviet Union, now Russia. Um, when the cluster munition ban treaty came along later, I mean, they had previously offset their landmines with anti-tank cluster munitions. So once the initiative comes forward to ban the cluster munitions, for them it was oh hell no. Like, and people would often use the Nordic countries as examples of countries that are like willing to take these positions of moral leadership. But when you have skin in the game, as Finland did, when they really didn't want to be invaded, they weren't going to agree to this next level of tech restriction. And so this comes back to just the theme of, having broad situational awareness of trade-offs can be important. Unfortunately, I forgot the purpose of this digression. I think the main thing to point at was that the arms industry can also try to shape the conversation. And Orbital ATK, well, no, I said the specific company, I think tried to profit from the effort to ban cluster munitions by just making like large area effect fragmentary bombs that don't leave behind unexploded ordnance. And so this is something that, it can make you cynical, but it also highlights a type of opportunity for influencing policy that people often don't consider, is that you could leverage competition within industry to push in a lower risk direction. This is something I've posed to people. Maybe it's naive, but I mean, the nuclear triad is almost all being modernized by Northrop Grumman. How do other defense contractors think through alternatives to various nuclear systems? Like, ultimately, you could do the analysis. It might turn out that it does make sense to modernize the U.S. triad the way they're modernizing it. But like the core point is that the defense industry has consolidated. There's a lack of competition. It's not just like a push. It shouldn't just be a push between buy more and more expensive and buy less. Like, there's different things potentially the defense ecosystem could be acquiring that might be more cost effective, that might be better at reassuring allies and providing deterrence without necessarily unnecessarily provoking Russia or China, and thinking through all the constraints to see if there are options that do better is like the kind of mindset I think that could be very useful. I'll give a naive example of this sort of thinking, which probably doesn't actually work, but this is just meant to be a stereotype of an idea. It's not, I think the economics don't work. I think there's some parts of the physics that don't work. Let's say people will make arguments against land-based missiles because they'll say there's these use it or lose it incentives. They're very responsive. They can hit a target potentially within 15 minutes, but they leave a very visible infrared signature when launched. So if both sides have early warning satellites, they should be able to see if each other launch these missiles. But if you have your missile silos and you can see incoming nuclear weapons, or maybe they're not nuclear, you probably have to launch your missiles or they'll be destroyed. You can choose to let the other side destroy your silos, but then you're in a much worse negotiating position post them having done that. If you launch, there's the risk, are you responding to a false alarm? Did your satellites get hacked? Like there's these concerns where you have like a very short window of time to decide. And so a lot of people are against land-based missiles for this reason. On the other hand, if you don't have land-based missiles in hundreds of silos, there's very few nuclear targets. There's nuclear submarines where there's many weapons on one platform. There's bombers where there's many weapons on one platform. There's only so many air bases. There's only so many sub bases. If in the future, AI, and once again, I don't think this is the near future, but if there's more distributed sensors, more trailing platforms and drones, maybe nuclear powered so they have long range, if there's the ability to clean up noise in the ocean and find nuclear submarines, which are traditionally the most survivable leg of the triad, then you're in a future situation where there's very few targeting points and you could get back to strategic instability. You could be in a position where there might be an advantage to striking first. And so a silly idea for dealing with this dilemma was you maybe take nuclear submarines or create hardened silos and sink them to the bottom of freshwater lakes that are very large. And so I think Russia has some huge lakes, and then the US, we have the Great Lakes. And it's like, I try to imagine targeting these lakes. If a nuclear weapon's going to come in and impact the water at the surface, it's going to be pretty far away from how deep the target is. So then you have to set off, multiple nuclear weapons. You almost have like a replenishing shield of all this water potentially flowing back in, to actually get close enough to destroy a hardened target. And you don't necessarily know, where within the lake these things have been positioned. That could be retaliatory forces. So and then the last benefit of a freshwater lake is, unlike seawater or the ground, when fresh water is bombarded by neutrons, it doesn't create a bunch of new radioactive isotopes. So you have something that's not flammable, not going to produce as much nuclear fallout, and it's a missile sink. So if the other side wants to go first, they have to waste a ton of missiles, and it's not guaranteed they destroy your nuclear deterrent. So you have something that's potentially very stabilizing as an idea. Now, I think the reason this doesn't work out is it's probably too expensive, and the fallout story I told is a little inaccurate. A lot of the fallout is just coming from the plutonium and the stuff that's in the weapons themselves, not just the weapons inducing radioactivity in the soil they hit. So I don't think it actually quite works out, but it was this sort of silly idea. Maybe you have, hardened shelters for nuclear submarines in the Great Lakes. Maybe you sink hardened silos that can surface missiles and launch them. It's like a very different way to do things. That was this potential idea of, strategic stability, while also having a missile sink, rather than having a potentially very vulnerable arsenal where very few weapons could take it all out at once. And so it's just looking for combinations. Like, I assume this type of idea was ruled about by the Rand Corporation probably in the 80s, or there's some political thing where Canada really doesn't like this. But it's this type of thinking that I think can be useful, to the degree there's alternatives. There might not be. It could just turn out to be the case that when you think through a lot of constraints, the arsenal we're going for makes sense on a lot of dimensions. But I'm not fully convinced that's true.
How does this sort of look in relation to your role at the moment? Like, is there a lot of thinking through these types of considerations with the work that you're doing? Or is it more looking at what other people are doing around these types of policies and seeing, where's money best distributed that way?
Right. So it's really a mix. I've spent a long time on this sort of nerd sniped silo. In terms of, areas we're looking into grant making, I mean, there's several trends that are really important to have in mind that I think deserve a lot of study. There's, we're in this sort of tripolar moment with Russia deploying all these novel types of nuclear systems and having completed a lot of its nuclear modernization. China is adding a whole bunch of missile silos. If we're in this scenario where defense planning continues in the way it was done before for the US, there would be very strong pressure to increase the number of nuclear weapons the US has once the New START treaty ends in 2026. And I mean, right now, just between US and Russia, there's no real full limits in force. There's still the New START treaty, and it seems that Russia is adhering to the center limits, but neither side's been doing, great verification since COVID.
Are you able to just quickly define what the New START treaty is?
Yeah, during the late Cold War, there was negotiation to limit the number of strategic nuclear weapons. A strategic nuclear weapon is, a weapon that goes all the way from my country to your country, usually high yield. So basically, weapons of intercontinental range that the Soviet Union and US could deploy, and to limit the numbers of those, to just be in a lower escalatory situation. On the US side, you can see some of this in Fred Kaplan's book. I think it's just called The Bomb, where, a lot of pressures for the US historically to have lots of nuclear weapons were sort of based on fairly bad analysis or outdated analysis. Like very early Cold War, you have these situations where, there's a requirement to destroy a particular target. Your missile's not that accurate, therefore the yield has to be huge and you have to use many weapons. Whereas, you get later into the Cold War, there's more precision. there's better knowledge of, the relationships between different targets. If you're attacking a network, you don't have to destroy every part of the network. You have to just take out, a choke point that constrains what the other side could do in a war scenario. So basically, defense planners realized the U.S. could do with way less weapons what it had planned out in its initially pretty crazy PSYOP war plans that involved, attacking multiple states at once. And that's just not, it's not tenable. I mean, some of this was solved by computation, but some of it was just doing better analysis. They realized they could cut nuclear weapons quite substantially and still be able to deter all the kinds of situations they wanted to be able to deter. I don't know as much about the Russian side or the Soviet side. It was Mikhail Gorbachev negotiating, with Reagan and these other. I don't know the full history of New START, but the basic point was that the U.S. and Russia limited the numbers of deployed launchers. So I think currently the limits are around like 1,500. So this is the summation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So for the US, those are in silos, the Minuteman missiles. In Russia, there's all sorts of different kinds of silo-based intercontinental ballistic missiles they have, as well as road-based mobile missiles. They're missiles on trucks that drive around and point up. Limits on the numbers that can be on submarines. And then limits on the number of bombers. For the purpose of the New START treaty, a bomber counts as one. It wouldn't matter if a bomber carries like 20 nuclear weapons. It would still count as one because bombers were viewed as relatively stabilizing within these negotiations. Bomber takes off, has to fly a while, could be recalled. You're less likely to hallucinate yourself into World War III than with something that gives very short reaction times. So, and I mean, there's a lot of pressures going this way. This is something, I would like to see people, how to put it, a lot more analysis. Maybe there's good analysis out there I haven't found yet already, but, there's different philosophies you can have toward nuclear modernization, where, on one side, you might want to constrain it because if you want a future with fewer nuclear weapons, you don't necessarily get there by making more nuclear weapons. On the other hand, since the national labs currently don't seem to have that much capacity to, quickly make a bunch of plutonium pits, you can get into this scenario where you have like a potential, like you can have the incentive to arms race to keep up, but there can also be the incentive to arms race because you think you can gain an advantage. And if it looks like to, say, Russia, that the US won't be able to make nuclear weapons in the future, then by racing on plutonium pits, there's like the potential to gain, in their view, potentially an advantage for when, the US is ahead in other tech and all they're relying on is deterrence, or in their mind. We might get into what I might call the cultural security dilemma later, and, threats for mutual misperceptions and threats based on just the type of regimes you have in different countries. But one thing the US sought to deter during the Cold War, like when you're negotiating reductions with the Soviet Union, on the one hand, you want fewer nuclear weapons. On the other hand, you don't want another state to be able to relatively cheaply, not actually cheaply, race to parity. You want basically the US and the Soviet Union to still have enough more nuclear weapons that no other state could end up with an incentive to very quickly get as many nuclear weapons and to become like a nuclear great power. And in some sense, with China now deploying, hundreds of more silos very quickly, there's like sort of the question, did the ability to deter that sort of thing fail? Like, and should we even think about it in terms of deterrence? Is it more just like an issue of mutual suspicion, or is it an issue of opportunity? I think there's mixtures of both. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, say the US had maintained the ability to very quickly produce lots of plutonium pits what would this have done? We wouldn't have had to keep as many nuclear weapons in the stockpile, which would then be less paranoid potentially to Russia and China. The idea that the US could rapidly do warhead uploads and suddenly have way more weapons is a potential thing you could imagine Putin or Xi being concerned about. Currently, as it stands, because of the size of the US stockpile, I think when New START expires, this info comes from the Federation of American Scientists. I think the US could basically more than double its number of nuclear weapons if it wanted to, whereas Russia can increase its number of nuclear weapons by a factor of 1.6. And what I mean by double is I don't mean like double the absolute number of nuclear weapons. I mean taking existing nuclear weapons and putting them on deployed systems. And so that, in one sense, could potentially be a disincentive for Russia to defect on the New START treaty. But because the US can't produce plutonium pits very fast, there's this like long-term potential where Russia, China might perceive they could produce more nuclear weapons and the US just wouldn't be able to match it.
Right. And so nuclear pits are basically just the ability to produce the raw material.
I don't actually know the full constraints on like whether it's a material constraint. Like I don't know as much about why the US can't produce these pits. Anyway, I do want to get off this tangent a bit for the reason of this isn't like, a grant area for us. I'm just highlighting a type of trade-off. Like we're not saying US should make more pits. I'm just highlighting that in terms of deterrence and in terms of escalation, you both want to avoid a situation where the other side has an opportunity to arms race for advantage, or where they're pushed to arms race because of fear. And if you have a combination that both exacerbates fear and makes it look like there's an opportunity to get ahead, that's like one of the worst case possible scenarios you could have for arms racing. You want to remove the option to get away or get ahead with inherently threatening technologies, and you want to be in a position where you're reassuring the other side in a manner that doesn't result in them spending on the most threatening technologies.
Right. And so how does that sort of come to play in the grant making that Longview does?
So I should probably just like back out, bigger picture, just go through types of grant making we're interested in, the general interest. I mean, for this specific thing, it would be, I'm interested in bringing forward talent that's more situationally aware of a lot of these sorts of trade-offs, getting people, working with the national labs, working with Congress on these issues where they're both broadly aware of risk reduction issues and competitive strategy issues, and basically going to be able to make recommendations that are more likely to land with policymakers based on the trade-offs they face. To go through our actual grant-making strategy, though, basically, there's a few different lines of effort we have. One of the, initially, I'd say this might be more of a front-loaded line of effort, is just getting a better understanding of the nuclear risk landscape. I was sort of getting into this earlier about just what trends are we addressing. So one trend is tripolar competition. Now that China is moving toward nuclear parity, how do you do deterrence in a sort of three-party equilibria? What should be done differently there? What kinds of analyses are going to help us figure this out? Forecasting exercises, where there are, historical case studies you can do to learn from history. It's not the first time there's been, tripolar competition in history. One could argue the India-Pakistan-China triangle has some analogies, but there's other nuclear triangles that we can learn something about in terms of deterrence and stability and the potentials for negotiation. There's, this idea of alternative nuclear futures. Can you have people be researching what kinds of different, deterrence, arms control, disarmament, or competitive equilibria could you end up in? How do they rank in terms of desirability? and like which are most likely. And it's like some of this kind of analysis that can help inform sort of a vision of where you want to go in the future. Another analytic area in terms of just better understanding the nuclear risk landscape is, better understanding the systemic effects of nuclear weapons. We have this history of concern with, nuclear winter, which I think is still like one of the number one concerns to have is if the use of many nuclear weapons, especially on city cores, could create devastation that isn't just of those cities and global supply chains, but the entire world in agriculture. I think that is one of the biggest possible threats. At the same time, there's questionable assumptions that went into a lot of this analysis, and so getting better ground truth on things like that could help inform risk reduction strategies. Another area is just the impact of a lot of different emerging technologies, and especially its impact on strategic stability. Various applications of AI, remote sensing. There's the potential, it's a mix. You can imagine stabilizing applications that expand the decision-making time that decision makers have, that stabilizing applications that make nuclear command and control more robust against interference, and applications that, just help rule out false alarms. But you can also imagine applications that help with first strike targeting, especially being able to retarget weapons and go very quickly. There's just, you can imagine, on the other side again, you can imagine applications that help with arms control verification. But you have to address, Russia and China where they're at, where they might be paranoid. A technology that gives some type of transparency might be the type of transparency that could also be used for targeting. So one of the areas of research that's interesting to me is applications of technology that are stabilizing and destabilizing, and how to think through alternative ways to modernize, to be pushing toward a more stabilized, lower risk world. How can we, lower nuclear risk without also lowering deterrence and guaranteeing we go into World War III? Like, where is there imperfect risk compensation and therefore opportunities to put everyone in a better situation than we were in before? So that was one key grant making area, is this sort of analysis of different nuclear futures and ways to reduce risk and better understanding the current nuclear risk landscape. Second area is trying to reduce, pushing for policies that can help reduce the risk of accidental or inadvertent nuclear war. I'd maybe more focus on the inadvertent aspect than accidental. Some people will say there's no such thing as accidental or inadvertent nuclear war. If we get in a scenario where weapons are used, people actually made a decision, there's so many safety mechanisms that you're very unlikely to completely by accident use nuclear weapons. So what would one mean by accident? It's misperceiving the other side's actions and then intentionally escalating to an extreme that you might not have otherwise escalated to if you've better understood what the other side was doing. In game theory terms, Thomas Schelling, called certain dynamics in, nuclear deterrence the threat that leaves something to chance. It might not be credible that a state would use nuclear weapons in a given scenario. So accordingly, a state might position itself, or its leadership might position the state in a manner that they might be unable to fully control their reaction in response to the other side doing something. An example of this that's not nuclear would just be, the way the U.S. shapes certain aspects of its defense alliances. By having a few thousand of our own troops on foreign soil, say if North Korea were to attack South Korea and the U.S. loses a few thousand troops, historically, when the U.S. loses, people in the thousands, we fight very hard. This is World War II. This is, 20 years of conflict following 9/11. It's potentially a very strong deterrent, but at a rational analysis level, are all the details of how we responded, say, to 9/11, rational in terms of cost benefit terms? Probably not. We probably spent far too much. As a understatement. There are a lot of issues with the way the U.S. prosecuted the war on terror, but because democracy is willing to sink this much money into it, like you can imagine, is a fairly credible deterrent. You don't want to kill U.S. troops if you're a foreign decision maker, and you especially don't want to kill them in large numbers. And so, I mean, this is a common theme you might call rational irrationality, as this situation where by making some decisions emotionally or neglecting certain pieces of information in decision making, a state or a company or whatever can improve their competitive strategic position. And that's a lot of the stuff you're dealing with in thinking about deterrence. Is there's an impact of culture, there's an impact of the social networks on potential decision makers. There's all these things to think through. This is part of the reason the US strategy of, how do I put it, tailored deterrence sort of resonates with these themes. You don't necessarily deter every country exactly the same way because they might make decisions differently. You have to think through, how does the other side actually make decisions, and how do you cultivate more calibrated strategic empathy so that you don't get nuclear blackmailed for something that doesn't make sense, but also you don't accidentally threaten the other side in ways that don't make sense if you reflect on your interests. And just better understanding each side's decision making can result in much better decisions. So anyway, we were talking about accidental and inadvertent nuclear war. Another kind of theme like this would be catalytic nuclear war. Like if there were a war scenario in Korea, could this escalate to a US-China conflict? Like this is a type of thing that's worth serious consideration and analysis of. Will the conflict in Ukraine escalate to a US-Russia conflict? That's also worth a lot of analysis. Another thing in this category of just mitigating near-term risks of nuclear war, there's reducing the probability of nuclear war, but there's also, consequences. And if a limited nuclear war has started, how do you prevent it from escalating further? So escalation management and better research on that, potentially even research up into including, better civil defense could be in scope for us. But I will admit, though, compared to the Cold War, it's probably less cost effective. It's more expensive to build things. Probably a lot of the best effective civil defense stuff is really just going to be planning. If nuclear winter is possible, things like, how do you figuring out how to feed people after a horrible scenario? There's the potential to save, millions and millions of lives if people think through these things in better detail in advance and get plans in place. But this is also the sort of thing where if the government is doing it and doing it quite visibly and putting it out lots of public messages, you have this risk of sending the signal you intend to escalate to being in a very nuclearly threatening scenario. So, this is one of the sorts of things where I ultimately think being in philanthropy, it's good for some of this kind of stuff to potentially come from eccentric philanthropists rather than the government, because then it's not this signal from the government of intention. It's rather the signal of what this philanthropist is interested in. That would not have worked as well during the Cold War, for the record, though, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was paranoid that, we're a capitalist, the US is a capitalist society. It's really these rich people pulling the strings. So in that scenario, you can imagine, depending on who the billionaire is, if they were throwing money behind civil defense stuff, then they would view that as like, oh, they're planning to go soon. Uh-oh. So you do have to consider that sort of factor, is how does the other side think through risk, and what are they likely to perceive and misperceive?
Right. So the unique opportunity that philanthropists have in this space is being able to promote things that are generally positive without giving off any of these sort of, downside risks of proliferation.
You have to consider the incentives of each side. There are certain areas where, say, the US pushes for a risk reduction initiative, then Russia and China might want to hold out as a negotiating tactic and hold the risk reduction hostage to some other policy issue. And that's one of the things that makes a lot of negotiations difficult, is there's all these interlinkages of different policies. And so, I mean, this is part of the reason it's very good to cultivate broad situational awareness of many different issues that are going to be on the table for such negotiations, and also for better area studies of Russia and China to better understand how they're thinking through decisions. In the context of, the war in Ukraine, Russia uh, pushing back on New START. I mean, I forget how to perfectly calibrate their degree of compliance, non-compliance. They said they're pulling out, but they hadn't. There's nothing visible to my knowledge right now that they've actually increased their number of nuclear weapons. Just they're not reporting. We're not doing the mutual inspections we were doing before. And in retaliation, the U.S. also stopped giving the same amount of information that Russia had been giving before, but on our nuclear forces. So by pulling back something that they viewed the U.S. as wanting, which was risk reduction on nuclear stuff, they're able to, posture more aggressively, potentially restrain U.S. behavior to some degree in Ukraine. Maybe not, but that's how it's viewed. And in the context of China's a lot of their, defense of their nuclear forces is premised on extreme secrecy. They don't want transparency necessarily, especially if they have lower numbers. They don't want the world knowing how many nuclear weapons they do or don't have, where exactly they are. Like if their arsenal is premised on sort of a different way of achieving survivability, certain measures aimed at risk reduction that include transparency might be viewed as like very threatening to them. And they might want, the U.S. to agree to certain reductions first before they even say what they have. They also probably don't want to negotiate from a position of having few weapons. That also might help explain why they would build missile fields so fast. Another factor, and it might be excess industrial capacity. They have a lot of people they need to employ. Making silos might be a thing. A bigger thing might be the potential for AI targeting. Their mobile missiles, trying to find those and target them in real time with, intelligence analysts looking through satellites. That's not exactly a very tractable problem. But if you have AI sorting through that at the blink of an eye, then that makes nuclear targeting much easier potentially. And I mean, there's some papers I've seen that argued it could like reduce the counterforce area, which means the area that would have to be destroyed for the U.S. to take out these nuclear forces by like 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So if people in China were having that thought before this paper came out, that could be a factor that would explain them building all these silos. Is there's more targets, so it becomes more of a numbers game, and it's hard to figure out if you'll actually destroy everything in a surprise attack. And then there's also the ability to respond faster, that if China were to detect an incoming attack, they would have missiles that could be launched very quickly, unlike their mobile missiles, where it seems like their warheads aren't even on the missiles. Like there's other trucks going around with the warhead, and you have some trucks with the missiles, and maybe they'll go in and out of hardened tunnels, but be driving around. It's sort of like a shell game. But, with AI, the shell game is easier to win. And so that's these are some of the factors that just go into thinking through, what kinds of things are stabilizing, what kinds of things are destabilizing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of play there.
In terms of reducing the risk of inadvertent nuclear war, like I got into these certain trade, like a big theme is properties of weapon systems. Like there's certain properties that might be inherently threatening and inherently destabilizing. And thinking that through, I think, is fairly important. And so there might be certain weapon traits that might make sense to push against, depending on the scenario you find yourself in. So one hypothesis, like I brought up land-based missiles before because of their potential for resulting in like the incentive to use or lose nuclear weapons. There's other things that can create a risk. One would be ambiguous weapons. If one is launching, say, a cruise missile in the context of a conventional war. So imagine it's the US and China. China has missiles that are ambiguous of if they're nuclear or not. Like if the US is trying to target a missile that they think would be headed for Taiwan and it's not nuclear, they might accidentally destroy something that could, in principle, be used for nuclear delivery. And from the Chinese side, if the US has cruise missiles that are also ambiguous, is it nuclear, is it conventional? They don't know what kind of attack they are under until the weapon arrives. And so you can imagine the potential to want to constrain certain types of weapons to reduce ambiguity. Ambiguity is a factor that could lead to inadvertent escalation. The threat from hypersonic weapons isn't necessarily their speed. Intercontinental ballistic missiles are already faster. The issue is they can maneuver much better than before, and that makes it ambiguous. What are they targeting? And it's also ambiguous if you have weapons that are, some are nuclear and some are conventional, and you don't know what's coming in. So there's certain dimensions of ambiguity that might make sense to reduce. All that said, you still have to consider the other side, which is states are negotiating for advantage. They might intentionally escalate certain risks for the sake of driving a harder bargain. And so in the context I gave earlier of negotiating weapon reductions and influence operations in Europe with these shorter range missiles, some of the most escalatory types of missiles, all these missiles went away during the INF Treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces are basically, there's an agreement to get rid of these like really short range, or not super short range, but like there's this type of nuclear weapon where it's like it can go far enough to hit these cities and fast enough that it's like very hard to respond to. If something's like a super short range nuclear weapon, like what, it's just going over the border, like it's not this same kind of decapitation threat. And it's like analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians pulled back their missiles from Cuba. The US pulled back missiles from Turkey. You have these intermediate range forces that could potentially hit each other's capitals very quickly and give very little time to respond. This is an escalatory situation you don't want to be in. And so it was the same for the INF Treaty within Europe, and the missiles were negotiated away, and that's good. But how do we get there? The Soviets didn't succeed at causing NATO to not deploy the missiles in the first place, but also NATO didn't succeed at pushing the Soviet Union to get rid of the missiles before they had deployed. You end up with several years where missiles are in place on both sides, and this higher risk equilibria where if something goes wrong, each side has very little time to react. But the fact that NATO did have missiles there 4 years made it more credible they would be staying, and so then you can negotiate them away without the Soviets having the expectation the weapons would just go away on their own and they would get to keep their weapons. So to summarize, sometimes you might want an escalatory system for negotiating leverage to get rid of the worst systems on both sides. So doing the analysis to figure out the negotiating frontier, what is likely to happen, and to determine, do you want to oppose the deployment of the most risky systems in the first place, or do you want to build leverage and maybe use a different type of system that's less risky to build leverage, to pull back, like to get mutual restraint on both sides? Doing that kind of analysis, I think, is incredibly important and fairly neglected, because a lot of people are focused more on just providing options, providing competitive advantage to the US. Other people are more focused on risk reduction in a vacuum. And it's through thinking through both sides and the fact that there's an adaptive competitor, I think is very important to figuring out on net, what do you do?
I'm curious if there's like a risk there of kind of like the means justifying the ends, or the ends justifying the means, rather, of like you say, you want to escalate the situation a little bit so that you can de-escalate it long term, but you end up raising the short-term risk unacceptably high, basically.
No. I completely agree with that. And there's particular ways to signal and to do analysis that help you head off that risk. I think in this Cold War case, the dual track approach, where it was years before the US deployed, like the US could have deployed weapons immediately. It didn't. Like, I think that was very good that there was this built-in delay. There's also a piece where you might have the option. This gets into sort of the field of net assessment, like trying to model the other side's decision-making processes, their bureaucracies, their tendencies. Where does each side have structural irrationalities and structural advantages? And how do you map your strengths to their weaknesses? But you can apply this type of reasoning not just toward competitive advantage, but toward risk reduction, where if you notice, say, Russia or China is from what an outside view might be irrationally paranoid about one particular type of weapon system, but in all realistic scenarios, it's not going to cause inadvertent escalation. Like, that might be the type of thing you purchase to derive negotiating leverage, as opposed to something that might be more inherently threatening, a first strike or something else like that. And so mapping out these sorts of, you might argue, like bureaucracy specific factors or political system specific factors, you can make a more specific argument of a type of capability you would go for in order to succeed at risk reduction longer term. Like, how do you do this at lower risk rather than deploying the maximally risky short range versus short range equilibrium? Might turn out that doesn't work. But I'm trying to get at like themes of how you avoid a pure mindless arms spending and justify means situation. It's, you want to adjudicate these at like the argument level and evaluate alternatives sincerely.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay, so basically the last two areas of our policies focus. One I highlighted before, which was just on like the issue of talent. This is broader than that. It's just building up the capacity of the field. So basically, there's some of these articles out recently on like the where's the missing nuclear expert and these things like that. The field, at least on the philanthropy side, has had far less funding than it has historically. The MacArthur Foundation, unfortunately, pulled out quite recently, and so you have a field that's having a deficit of like many millions per year compared to what it was at before. And by field, I just mean academia, analysis outside of government on nuclear issues and risk reduction. And so being in this position, you have to prioritize, what organizations do we want to be trying to save and help out, and can we afford to do it? Because our own budget is also constrained. And also, like, how do we prioritize, career pipelines for bringing more talent into the field that is able to have the relevant situational awareness and competencies to like make a difference in policy analysis and recommended good paths forward. So the talent and organization sustainment side is a big potential area of grant making. And what I would call the last and like potentially longest term area of grant focus would be, shifting attitudes toward nuclear weapons and policies. Laws and values shape policy choices. There's, the prospect of, these weapons just being incredibly destructive if used. If there's other ways to achieve deterrence and reassurance with fewer or lower risk, or just like get paths to disarmament long term, it's going to require, a different kind of thinking to get there. And so we're interested in some things toward that. But at this point in time, we're still thinking through what is the best approach. As I gave the example before with like influence operations that have been in this space to steer public attention pro or con nuclear weapons, we want something more sophisticated than that if you're developing public pressure.
How much do you think the sort of nuclear security being thrust into the public limelight a little bit with the release of Oppenheimer about a month ago now, do you think that's going to change the public dynamic or discourse at all, with that being in the popular culture now to some degree?
I think it's increased discourse, but I'm not sure how much it's changed discourse.
Right.
And personally, I didn't like the movie that much. I think it was very focused on Oppenheimer's life and his like security clearance process, and they're just like all these interesting things it didn't spend that much time on in terms of the construction of the bomb and the morality of the decisions that were made. There's just, it got into it a little bit, but I don't know. I actually got the privilege of watching Oppenheimer right after this nuclear policy boot camp in San Diego, and I was sitting next to Ambassador Brooks, who'd previously, he's been in this field for many years. I think like aside from his like position at the national lab and at the national labs, like I believe during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was on a destroyer. Like he has been in this field a very long time. But after the movie, he made the comment to me, I don't know if this movie is actually going to change things. I think it's increased the salience. I don't know if it would actually like renew the peace movement or push it in any particular direction. I think it just creates more attention on nuclear weapons. And like, I mean, we think, I mean, there should be some attention here. There should be more philanthropy in this space. Just the size of nuclear philanthropy compared to like climate philanthropy, I mean, it's just puny. It's like, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it's like climate philanthropy is like a factor of at least 100 bigger. I forget the exact conversion, but it's just like, what are things that could really mess up the planet? Like the nuclear war is one of those things that could really mess up the planet, depending on how it goes. And so yeah, I think it deserves more attention.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think for me, I mean, it gave me some backstory to sort of the creation of the bomb that I hadn't really dug that deep into myself. But it also made me more concerned about the risks from AI
Yeah.
and sort of global catastrophic biorisks as well, because it just seems like the movie paints this picture of a group of academics and researchers who are very, intellectually focused and had at least some moral sort of approach to how they were designing this thing, or sort of what the intention was. Um, but there was sort of this, some discussion and discourse around like, is this the right thing to be doing? Whereas the timescales at which AI could be developed, or the next sort of like the sort of step increase in capabilities could occur, and the same thing with bioweapons and sort of the more, the developments in access to biological capabilities. It just gives the rise or the opportunity here for people to act almost on their own, potentially, or in very sort of isolated sort of settings which don't have these sort of checks and balances, or just, yeah, greater discourse and greater sort of scrutiny, I guess, over it.
Right. I mean, I do think like long term has the potential to just be so extremely threatening on so many different domains. And bio threats also, because they spread on their own. Like with nuclear weapons, someone has to make the choice for where each weapon is going. That might be different in the future with AI, but in the near term, I don't see people wanting to automate nuclear command and control. It's possible that more personalist regimes, Xi's China and Putin's Russia, may want to use more AI. However, like historically, it Russia's been fairly algorithmic. I don't expect necessarily machine learning to be used to decide a lot of things in their like nuclear plans. But you can imagine AI capabilities being incorporated. I guess to get back though, like this is one of the things that matters. Like in the long term, when you have bio threats and AI enabled threats becoming elevated within conversation to the level of existential risk, like the way multiple strategic technologies interact when countries are negotiating risk reduction, like it might be difficult to silo conversations. And if things are highly asymmetric between countries, the US was comfortable getting rid of all these, let's say, tactical nuclear weapons during, like, after the end of the Cold War. And now we're in the situation with Ukraine where Russia has a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. The US has few, but the US has immense conventional superiority. And so then there's this question of, would Russia feel secure using a tactical nuclear weapon? How would that escalate? How would the US respond? Like, the more asymmetric competition is between peers, the more you can have difficulty agreeing how to reduce risk, because it's not like I reduce this thing and you reduce the exact same thing. You'd have to have asymmetric arms control to get agreement, and thinking through that is incredibly complex and thorny. And the question is, can we imagine a future with things like this with AI, um, where AI is also a strategic technology and it's dual use, so there's incentive to use it, but where there's also potentially very threatening use cases that might be very hard to verify.
For engineers, policy is a really interesting career path to bring up and bring sort of to the attention of engineers, because it's not something that engineers would typically consider an option for increasing their impact. I know policy was never something that in the sort of the 10 or so years that I was at university studying through undergrad through to PhD, like I never once thought of policy as a potential sort of career pathway for me as an engineer. Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on where people with a technical background, such as engineers, fit into the policy space and specifically the nuclear policy space.
So it is true that if you just go to school for engineering and then you start applying for policy jobs, people will be pretty confused. They're not generally always looking to hire engineers. Sometimes people might even take that as an indicator you weren't succeeding in tech industry or something like that. So thinking through your strategy for breaking into policy with an engineering background is something that's important to do. For me, the best route was really using graduate school. I went to Johns Hopkins SAIS, and given the options I had available at the time, that was one of the most efficient routes for me to transition into policy, because it built up generally my policy writing skills and gave me enough background and context and also networks that it made just switching into policy jobs pretty easy, and enabled me to take my comparative advantages at the types of reasoning and problem solving engineers do and then apply them in policy. So I think it's often going to be highly individualized and idiosyncratic, the best route for a given individual to break into policy. But I think it's important to reason about, what are your comparative strengths? I think in engineering, unfortunately, there's a lot of stagnant fields, but that still train rigorous reasoning and problem solving. And those same skills can be applied elsewhere, provided you find a route. A silly example I like to give of someone, this isn't quite a switch to policy, but it's just like a huge pivot, is Joe Henrich became like the director of Harvard's, I think, like human cultural evolution lab or something like that. I forget the exact name of the position, but basically he started out as a systems engineer before then adding anthropology. And through that combination of rigorous systematizing reasoning, thinking about structural explanations, plus the inside field experience that one gets doing anthropology and ethnographies and just communicating with people directly, the combination of those skills put him far ahead of other people he was competing with in the field of anthropology. And so, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, where are there areas where once you add engineering knowledge, you can develop a comparative advantage? I think that's the kind of thing that makes sense to want to try to do. So to give some concrete examples of that kind of thing, I think Rand Corporation can be a good place for some people to work. It's basically a federally funded research and development center. There's all sorts of technical problems you can work on there that are informing policy, but at the same time, it's not directly like a policy position where you're just communicating to people all the time, not doing any technical analysis. It's a mix. And I think certain environments like that can be a good place for people to aim for.
Right. So that's more of like a technical translator type role where you're looking at the technical details of something and then basically distilling that into communication that can be sent to people with less technical or non-technical backgrounds.
Yes, I think that role is often going to be one of the comparative advantages of engineers. The ability to understand technically complex subjects um, naturally can help people lean into the niche of translator roles. And I mean, this is just one of the most important skills to develop if you're pivoting in, is just your communication skills, both writing, but as well as just your general communication skills. Being able to communicate technical subjects clearly, concisely, and tactfully without jargon, just in plain language. The more you're able to do that, the more you'll be able to basically write influentially on technical subjects. In a lot of areas, your competition in terms of technical competence might not be that skillful. Um, I remember when I first went to the National Security Commission on AI, people joked that I had more AI experience than most people there, and all I had taken was one class, Engineering's machine learning class. Most of my other engineering work was not relevant. Just being a technical engineering minded thinker and having like a little bit of a knowledge advantage can be a huge advantage where in domains where there's not already a lot of domain specific expertise. And so that is a thing to keep in mind. Anytime there's something related to emerging tech where a lot of people are jumping on a bandwagon quickly, if you actually have some underlying background knowledge that the people who've just been policy generalists pivoting into it don't have, that can be a source of advantage.
And in terms of developing the communication skills, is there anything that you did to consciously develop that, or anything that you recommend to people who come from a more technical background to sort of build that uh, those communication skills?
So I wish I had a better general recommendation. In the grad school I did at SAIS, they had a lot of training emphasizing improving um, writing. Like the director of the program would have these seminars basically on how to write good, and just all these different kinds of advice about attempting to write something every morning. A really silly thing that improved some of my writing, not on everything, was just honestly, it was arguing with people, like stupid arguments on Facebook, where in each case, my goal was just, get to the point, be impartial, be friendly, but if you disagree, you still must articulate your position and not look like a crazy person. And that kind of thing forced my writing to improve quite a bit. I don't think this is the best thing for policy. If you probably don't want to be all over certain social media for policy, but it depends on certain things. You have to be on Twitter for certain kinds of positions. So maybe that would be a place to practice this, although it's not quite as long form.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could also see there being, I mean, I too benefited, I think, from sort of like daily writing as well, even just random thoughts and things like that. But actually trying to work on translating sort of nebulous thoughts bumping around in my head to words on the page, and doing that as like a consistent practice for a year or two. Uh, I felt that really helped. Certainly when it came to writing my PhD thesis, it made it a little bit easier to get those thoughts out of my head and onto the page. And I think it made it a bit clearer as well.
I guess two things on this theme. I'd say never let a good idea escape. If you have a good idea, write it down immediately. Maybe you have a notes app on your phone. And the second part that goes along with that is always be iterating on different ideas. Be iterating on different career plans, be iterating on different ideas for policy. The more you're iterating both your thinking and your writing, the higher quality writing you're going to have and the higher quality thinking you're going to have. And so just always be, I don't know, building up your world model gradually over time while at the same time exercising these skills. These are kind of like things you want to have going on in the background. If you have shower thoughts, write them down right after, or get one of those silly pencils that lets you write on water notes or whatever those are called. I forget, aqua notes or something. I haven't used those in a while, but for some people, that's what they need.
Yeah. Do you make that as like part of like a formal practice? Like, do you sit down and dedicate regular time to iterating on thoughts and policy ideas that you have?
Often it's not explicit, planned out in advance time for brainstorming. It's more of like a trigger action pattern or plan. Um, I notice a certain idea. I notice I have some free time. Or even if I don't have free time, I just jot something down before going back to what I was focused on. Um, if I have to, like, yeah, I think I have a lot of environmental and situational heuristics for when I should be engaging in this sort of activity. It might be good to have some more just like pre planned times I do that sort of exercise, but I haven't been doing that as much lately.
Yeah. What are the environmental triggers for you?
If there's like a big project ahead of me, but I'm not quite sure of the right approach, a common thing, I mean, I've done, how do I put this? 3 times in my career, I've done the same sort of thing. Once at the AI Commission, once at OpenAI, and most recently when coming to Longview Philanthropy, where basically I'm trying to simultaneously build out my own understanding of a subject while then also engage in a broad literature review to basically map out a certain type of threat. At the AI Commission, it was AI enabled threats in general. At OpenAI, it was AI enabled threats specifically in like the information domain, influence operations, disinformation, things like that. And then at Longview, it's been more of like what are the worst case nuclear scenarios. And so there's just thinking about that on my own. There's doing literature reviews in parallel, and then there's pulling those kinds of things together to try to build out like a taxonomy of types of threats. And then from there, I basically keep refining it. And that's where like the iteration would come in. If I was trying to, say, finish writing up a field overview, or at the AI Commission, more so my initial big literature review is focused on techno-economic competition between states, not just threats, but I was trying to make a taxonomy of like what do states do and what are they looking out for. And so it's this process of sort of trying to perceive all the relevant factors, both reasoning about it on your own and then trying to go look for what other people have found. So you're looking before you're biased by other people, and then you try to like have other people fill in the kinds of stuff you miss, and then you try to reflect on it, pull it all together into an overall coherent picture before you then try to basically list out all the things you can do about the overall situation. Sorry, this is very abstract, but this kind it's sort of like in engineering. You're defining your constraints, and before you go reasoning about what is the best way to solve this problem. Like once you've defined all the constraints to a problem, it's much easier to figure out the space of solutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, I guess one thing kind of related to your sort of transitions between different fields there is you have worked across a number of places in a number of different fields throughout your career. So I'm curious around about what your decision making process around job change and doing those sort of pivots are. Like how sort of opportunistic was this, or did you really how much planning went into making these changes, going from yeah into AI, then into nuclear, and sort of jumping around a bit as you have? And is there sort of like a common thread that you sort of see in this?
So I will say I'm not always engaged in super long-term planning. But that said, I do have phases of it. Maybe I should update how frequently I do those phases. But a general goal is to try to have some amount of long-term planning and some amount of opportunistic searching running in parallel, and trying to do this in a way that preserves your attention. Things like email reminders, being in the right network so certain opportunities will like come across your radar by default. Um, Putting long-term plans with A, B, Z options like down on paper and iterating them over time. When I think of extremes of this in my career, One extreme, let's say this happened twice, was like, I don't know, maybe middle school. I was planning my career. I wanted to go be in the Air Force. I wanted to be an engineer, and I wanted to be a politician someday. And you look at like the silliness of the plans I made at the time. I mean, it involved going to all sorts of different schools you definitely could not go to back. Doing policy, how would I put it? Political science and engineering PhD also isn't really a route that made much sense. But this overall style of thinking led me to the Air Force Academy. From there, I did transfer to UMD and start studying engineering. I had this giant plan that just did not survive contact with reality. But the initial impetus um, basically still gave me many ideas as I started pivoting later. Another example of long term planning that was done much better during an EA Global, I believe this is 2016, I had a conversation with Jason Matheny about policy grad school options. I mentioned before, Johns Hopkins SAIS was my best option by far, but that it was at that EA Global where Jason pointed out that school to me after I reasoned through with him, my initial silly plan of going through the Air Force Academy, becoming a general someday, and pivoting between a bunch of fields. Um, and he just basically pointed out that the kinds of things I wanted to do could just be done much more quickly through SAIS. I read about it more. I read about the history of the Office of Net Assessment, and it just became clear with my background compared to how hard it was to get into other policy programs. I could just score highly on some more like technical things like the GRE and some econ classes, get in, and then very rapidly within 2 years be able to place into pretty good positions. And that's what happened when I got to the AI Commission. Um, they hired General Kumo after me. They gave us the same title. Obviously, he's more senior and is probably paid better and more influential. But I mean, I could not have done that sort of thing out of the Air Force Academy or within a few years of the Air Force Academy. The other people in the Air Force on the commission were like colonel level and up. So it was the long term planning aspect, though, is as soon as I met Jason and had this conversation, I started like drawing out like what is required for me to get into the school. And I made like sort of a 5-ish year plan of like how to within 1 year pivot and get into the school, and then how to be tailoring my resume in the meantime to be able to get an AI policy position afterward. And I think that plan was incredibly successful. Some of it, like some of the planning details, I got to fill in during like my pivot stage. Um, Part of how do I put it? There are some other jobs I had in the meantime where basically I had some amount of free time and I could just keep working. The 80,000 hours has this ABZ planning guideline. And so I would just keep, adding detail into my options. My fallback option, if SAIS wasn't going to work out, is that I was going to go to the University of Maryland with in-state tuition, and I had like cultivated that option as both a backup and a path into the better grad school for what I was aiming at. Um, and so that was like not a super long-term plan, but at the same time, I knew there were many options at the end. Like I think the longer term you get, the more you want to be reasoning about paths that give you many options as opposed to aiming for one specific job. You want to try to divide jobs into reference classes and types of skills and types of networks, and then to be in multiple networks that are paths to the types of jobs you want to be going toward, and to be decisively cultivating like skills you would need at each step.
Right. So you kind of want to look at like what's the archetype role that I kind of want to be in 5 years' time, and what career capital do I need to build up between like now and then, and actually thinking a bit more long term about that, and not rushing to feel like you need to make the jump straight away, or it has to be done in the next 3 months, or my next career move or my next job has to be like in this archetype. Like you actually, yeah. take more of a patient view.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. When I think of more or opportunistic moves, I often think of times where the default long-term plan isn't working out. When I was at the AI Commission, the commission's budget, eventually runs out, and so I was looking to find ways I could secure a position in DoD, but the budget was running out, and also other people weren't really getting hired straight off the commission either. There's only so many billets. There's a 2-year budget cycle. There's lots of reasons, independent of your skill. It can just be hard to stay in a given government office with the way the budgeting process works. So in that case, I pivoted over to OpenAI. That was somewhat opportunistic, but I had initially applied there with basically looking at 2 different positions. One was more on like the societal harms of AI and mitigating those. Another was more on like the global geopolitics of AI. And I applied to both with interest since there had been relevant things I touched on at the AI Commission. And I reached out even though I wasn't fully qualified. The jobs both required a PhD in theory, but they were interested in me given my time at the AI Commission and the amount of time I'd spent directly on these relevant subjects, the relevant subjects within their ads. And so when I ended up interviewing with them, I actually pushed back a little on the positions because in the back of my mind, my long-term goal was to continue work with the government if possible. So what I did was I gave them sort of my research agenda and a bunch of things I thought I could do good research for them on, and pitched them on basically doing a contract, or maybe they pitched me on the contract part, but I was just giving them like, hey, what's a version of this position if I'm not here long term? I forget if I pitched the contract or they pitched that, but basically we found an agreement on a few research subjects I could do, and that would give me the option to quickly go back to government if I did find something later. And so you want to be thinking, sometimes when you apply to jobs, if you have a positive sum offer for the employer that is slightly or somewhat different from their job ad, and you know enough about the employer to know they'd be interested anyway, you might sometimes try to pitch another kind of thing. I mean, it shows initiative. If it's something they can easily do, that's the kind of thing you have to assess. If it's a giant bureaucracy and there's a very specific position they have with a very specific thing they want a person to do, and there's not just like ability to fund other things, then maybe don't go for that kind of move. But the move to OpenAI was opportunistic. And then similar with my move to Longview Philanthropy, I saw the ad come up. I had just wrapped up or was wrapping up a paper I was working on at OpenAI at the time. There had been other research I was trying to spin up, but it wasn't quite subject-wise the best fit for OpenAI. It would have been on AI regulation in sort of a broader context with probably more implications for Meta or Facebook at the time. But yeah, overall, I think that the combination you want to be looking for is what are ways you can be maintaining your options at each step going forward while still actually getting something done.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway from that for me, or what it kind of sounds like, using this long-term planning and actually thinking in terms of like 5 or so years to be able to develop an intuition around where you want to go, like what are the types of work, types of roles you want to be doing, and having a relatively clear but not concrete understanding of like what that looks like, so that when it comes to opportunistic things, you have an intuition around whether that fits into this long-term plan or not, and whether it's better than your default path on this long-term plan. And then, yeah, just making sure you keep yourself open to revising that and iterating on that over time and not seeing it as set in stone, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. The only thing I would caveat a little is you do want to think of at least like a few different concrete examples to help ground it, your reasoning, and to like break into archetypes, and also to just reason through all the constraints. Like in national security policy, security clearances can be important. And so making sure you're on a track to be able to get one of those, I think could be especially important for an engineering type, because I think technically detailed work is just going to be disproportionately more likely to require clearance. And if you're at the intersection of that and policy, I mean, depending on what you're doing, if it's a DoD related thing, there's just a high probability a lot of the kinds of work you might want to be able to do would require clearance. And so that's something that's going to be worth considering in a U.S. context. I assume there would be similar considerations in other countries as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, so making sure you keep that open as an option, and you're not burning any potential pathways there by taking work that would undermine your ability to get a security clearance in the future. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that a big part of what you do at Longview as part of one of the primary areas of grant making is bringing talent into the nuclear policy field. What recommendations do you have for engineers who are interested in working in policy, and sort of what specific skills, other than sort of the communication that we touched on before, should people be looking at building to sort of break in? And sort of, are there any vectors that you recommend people, like any specific roles, companies, organizations?
So I'm trying to think of I feel like my response to this will be kind of multi-level. If you're just exploring, am I interested in nuclear weapons policy? I would just, honestly, I'd send me an email, Matthew@longview.org, and just, ask me some questions. But if you know you're into this field, if you know, how do I put it? Like, if you know this is the kind of thing you want to do, there's certain programs that I think are very good for skilling up. There's the Public Policy and Nuclear Threats Boot Camp in San Diego. It's a 2-week long educational program. If you're trying to pivot into this space and to just know all the basics and be able to just think productively on these issues, if you otherwise don't have a ton of experience or a ton of like well-rounded experience, I think a program like that could be really good. There's another program called ISODARCO, ISODARCO, which also has a pretty good education program on nuclear issues. And then lastly, there's the program on nuclear issues, Nuclear Scholars Initiative at CSIS. That can also be a really good program for getting into the field, improving your writing, knowing who's who, and stuff like that. Those 3 programs, I've gone through all of them. It definitely, all of them together did quite a lot for me in terms of this field. In terms of places to work, it's really broad but the issue can be funding. A lot of the nonprofits are probably going to have some issues hiring. So one thing to have in mind for like nonprofits, like think tanks, is to have an angle that is fundable. And for a lot of people, that's going to be other emerging tech. The intersection of emerging tech with nuclear is a common theme for people finding relevant jobs. If you're in the Department of Defense or you're applying to something like the Presidential Management Fellowship, I think space is currently an area of a lot of growth in government. So if you're able to find something at the intersection of nuclear and space, or how would you deal with like the detonation of a nuclear weapon in space, things like that might be an angle into the field where there's actually some hiring. It's pretty tricky though. If I were to just like list through think tanks, there's places like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, there's the Federation of American Scientists, Council on Strategic Risks, NUORG, Global Shield, generally focused on catastrophic risk reduction. There's the Nuclear Threats Initiative. If you're in the UK, there's BASIC and the Chatham House. Some other places in the US, CSIS. There's the James Martin, I'm trying to remember, I think it's Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey. There's the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. there's Brookings. At Harvard, there's the project on managing the atom. There's the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. There's just like a ton of places. If you're on like the competitive strategy side of things, there's like the Scowcroft Center, Hudson Institute, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. There's just a lot of places someone could potentially go, but a lot of places are having funding troubles, and thinking of angles where you can get to your first job despite the funding difficulties in the field, I think is important.
Yeah, it definitely seems that, I mean, across the board, funding is just more tenuous at the moment with the economic downturn, but definitely nuclear seems to be a recurring theme that I'm hearing from a few different people I've chatted to in the space. Is there any sort of, yeah, if someone was engaging in the long-term planning and thinking, yeah, they want to be working at one of those places in the next 5 years, but don't necessarily have the pressure to jump in right away, are there particular skills that you would recommend they would try and build up if they were to move into a new job, say in the next like 3 to 6 months? Like, what skills or experience out of the nuclear policy space would be useful for people to build up in the meantime?
Beyond writing, I just think writing is so general. Like the writing and communication skills can just be applied in so many different directions because it's a very general skill. And if you're refining your ability to make clear arguments on technical subjects, that just has so many different directions, it can help you secure employment. And similar to what I was saying before, the building up your stack of ideas, having competing ideas in mind that are policy related. They don't have to all be nuclear ideas. It could be something about, how do I put it? It could be a type of budgeting strategy. It could be a type of bureaucracy reform. There are things that are, how do I put it? When you focus on multiple different policy problems and find common themes, it's those common themes might be something you can get good at that will have transfer value between a few different potential policy positions. Like one example would be things like forecasting. That's a general skill, a general line of analysis, which although is often better calibrated when you're focused in one field over time and you become an expert on that and the most calibrated on a specific issue, that skill may be transferable to some degree, or at least your sense of calibration is transferable separately from just having impressive analyses you can share when you're interviewing. One that was sort of, I don't know, I'd almost call it a one-trick pony because I haven't gotten the chance to do it again since, but I think it was a good skill initially, was Monte Carlo modeling. I did some Monte Carlo modeling before I got into defense analysis for just evaluating the impacts of different policies. At the time, I was working at a fire sprinkler lobby group, and I tried to create an estimate of how many lives on expectation would be saved by basically updating the building codes in the city of Philly. That was quite, I don't know, a problem set up. Just getting all the data was kind of tricky, but we had some proprietary business data too. But the ability to set up that model, I think signaled really well when I went to interview at defense contractors later.
Yeah, so kind of coming up with these projects that you could either do in the scope of your current work or perhaps as like something in your free time.
And also with that type of project, it forced me to think through just like multiple aspects of a problem. And it's these things that force you to engage with a problem at depth that will, especially when you're going after the more general version of a problem, something that is useful in multiple different domains. I think, I don't know, you can find, how to put it, quotes from like, what was it, Richard Hamming at Bell Labs. There's some old, I don't know, career advice sort of blog or column he had that also has just good advice for this type of thing. This is also a common theme at Rand Corporation. It's if you're looking for transferable career capital and you're solving a problem, first ask yourself, is this problem very domain specific or is it general? And to the degree it's general, formulating your response in more general terms and having that in mind when you go look for other opportunities, I think is useful. There will always be something specific to the field you're on. Other things are not nuclear weapons. So I don't find myself reasoning about yields in any other domain whatsoever. But there are some things that are more general, like reasoning about incentives and risk compensation and things like that. And there are certain thought tools I have for thinking through incentives, thinking through bureaucratic inertia, thinking through how high stakes decision making processes work and how they fail, and all the kind of thinking and analysis and reading and studying I've done on those kind of subjects has felt much more generally useful. I do recommend people look at the Horizon Fellows. They have a lot of nifty recommendations for people to look into, separate from 80,000 hours.
That's more focused on the nuclear policy space?
It's more focused on AI and bio so far.
Okay.
But they have generally a lot of good national security tech, emerging tech related opportunities that are worth keeping your eye on. I know I've definitely forgotten to list a bunch of orgs, but I'm not going to invent another laundry list in 5 seconds. So I'll probably leave it at what I've given so far.
Sounds good. So one sort of fun question we ask at each guest at the end is, what do you wish you had invented and why?
Many years ago, I wish I sort of invented and marketed basically a version of Soylent first, but mapping it out for bioavailability issues and other nutritional things that Soylent isn't quite optimizing for. I always thought when I looked at this weird food market that there was just a lack of deep optimization, but maybe it's just too expensive and hard for anyone to figure that sort of thing out. If I take another step back, though, at another level, I've always been interested in entrepreneurship and building things, but in some ways, you might argue the world of atoms has become more stagnant, and the area that requires more entrepreneurship and more invention is policy. And I think bringing an engineer, I wish, I don't know, I'd figured out a way to more decisively be both an engineering mindset and working in policy at the same time from like the start of my career. I was always like hopping back and forth, but I never found the one way to map them together from undergrad, or found like just one policy idea to work on iterating. And I think, the difficult thing is if you invent a policy idea while you're very young, you don't yet have the social network to do anything with it. Whereas with engineering, you invent something, you go get a patent, you can go build a thing. What's the political equivalent? Like a coup? You don't want to do that.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, if you can get mentored by someone and give a different higher level person good advice because you've developed a good idea independently, that's a better route to go. And things like congressional commissions, if you can be like a technical staffer on a congressional commission, that can be a good route. I'm trying to remember, there's things like AAAS fellowship, like looking for places that technical people can be influential and reeled into a policy influencing process, I think can be important.
Yeah, that makes sense. How important do you feel mentorship is in the policy space? Because it does seem like the kind of thing that you would need, especially if you're coming in very fresh.
Yeah, because a lot of times without mentorship, you'll sort of end up in these analysis paralysis situations, and quite rationally so. There's all these sorts of things where people just have these weird emotions and they feel locked up, and they don't always know why, but it's often like quite rational. If you could wreck your career by saying something stupid and you don't really know what someone's incentives are or what's going on, it's just really intimidating to have some of these types of policy careers at a high level too early on. Something I really lucked out with at the AI Commission was just the mentorship of this colonel I was working with. He was incredibly smart and charismatic, and just enabled me to focus on my research and then bulletproofing it against all sorts of different criticisms or things that could cause the ideas we were working on to go nowhere. And so if you find a good boss, a good team, people that you can be high trust around, and you don't have to worry about your impressions and things like that as much. That's probably a better way to start if you're a technical person moving into the more of the social world, as opposed to vice versa.
Yeah. There, other than sort of that high trust, lower sort of weighting on individual impression, sort of teams and spaces. Are there any other characteristics you're looking for when you're considering a team or a mentor, or a team where you might have mentorship opportunities?
So, I mean, this is somewhat related, but the thing that came to mind was this guy I was working with was really a bureaucracy ninja because he'd been in government a long time and had survived selection pressure to get to the position he was at. He just really knew how to deal with internal strategy within large bureaucracies really well. And so having someone I could communicate honestly with about that sort of stuff who is basically on the same team, that was super useful. I mean, one thing that people often bring up for Congress, and I don't have this experience because I haven't really done political positions, is people say, like, it's impossible to play a real 4D chess in Congress. If you're trying to work for a party you don't agree with, or if you're trying to like fly under the radar in an office you completely disagree with, it's probably not going to work. All the sorts of mental gymnastics you'll have to play will just generally erode your effectiveness. So wherever you go, even if ultimately your theory of impact in mind is replaceability, they might screw something up, and I would be less likely to be the person that screws something up. Wherever you go can't be completely at odds with you. If it's completely at odds with you and your philosophy, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it'd also just be probably a nightmare to work there.
Yeah, miserable. Yeah, I mean, you want to look for aligned teams where, you can develop that level of trust.
Terrific. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been terrific.
Awesome. Good chatting with you.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Matthew. For detailed show notes, head to engineeredforimpact.show/Matthew. That's MATTHEW. If you'd like to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is leave us feedback on our website or share it with a friend or colleague. Thanks for listening, and happy problem solving.